It's the Vicki McKenna Show, and standing by on the Middleton Ford hotline is Will Flanders from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty to talk about what happens if Act 10 goes away. And if we lose the legislature, Act 10 is going to go away. First off, let's remind people what Act 10 is, Will. It's been a long time, and we've all gotten used to it, and we've begun to take it for granted. So let's remind people that Act 10 was the big budget reform that caused all the controversy when Scott Walker first came into office.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and I'm surprised. You're right. There are folks up here now that don't even remember Act 10 because it's a decade or more in the past, but it's the most meaningful piece of legislation we've had in Wisconsin in many decades. I think it's not an overstatement to say. This is the collective bargaining reform. It limited the power of public sector unions and teachers unions as well as other public sector unions across the state. And what we wanted to do with this report, as you say, it's under threat if we lose the legislature. It's also under threat by a court case currently. So we wanted to point out to folks, here's what the financial cost would be if this legislation was overturned.
So first off, so everyone understands, it didn't ban unions. You know, the left is going to say that. It did return an enormous amount of fiscal flexibility back to state and local governments. So unions could no longer, through collective bargaining agreements, demand that 100% of the contributions to their retirement be paid for by taxpayers. Things like that. They couldn't demand to use their pet insurance company that cost 4 times as much as a competitively competitively bid policy. They couldn't do that. Those kinds of things. They couldn't, demand extra dollars on top of step increases, on top of this, double dipping retirement, et cetera. So how much money are we talking about here if it goes away tomorrow?
Yeah, so we did 2 reports on this. This most recent one that came out this week looked at local government. The local government costs, we're looking at $480 million per year. And I'll just add the other costs in there as well for school districts. That's an even larger number of employees across the state, as most folks are familiar. We're looking at $1.6 billion a year between health care, retirement costs, and new salary costs for school districts and local governments across the state. So a huge hole in local budgets that have to be made up for by local taxpayers.
Yes. Most of the reform focused on the retirement system and the health insurance costs. That's what most of the reform focused on. Whereas even though state law said that Wisconsin taxpayers contribute 50% to the retirement of government employees for their retirement, the employee themselves were supposed to kick in another 50%, but over time in many collective bargaining agreements, that went to 100% taxpayer-funded contributions to retirement. So that just simply reset to normal. And then they were asked to pay 12.5%, if I recall correctly, toward their health insurance premiums, and that those policies were going to be competitively bid.
Yep, you got that exactly right. Just sort of the same stuff that the rest of us that are in the private sector have to deal with, right? None of us, or very few of us, unless we're extremely lucky, get 100% of our retirement covered or 100% of our healthcare costs. All these things we're requiring was that public sector unions be in the same boat as the rest of us. And apparently that's too much for these folks that are suing or for Democrats that want to overturn it to bear.
So $2.1 billion. And that's just simply calculating the expected increases in health insurance, in salary increases, and going back to the old way where the retirement contributions were picked up 100% by taxpayers. And that doesn't include any of the other impacts that might be coming because of Act 10. What is the court case? See, the Democrats really would prefer the court case to not actually have to take up a vote. But what is the court case arguing?
The court case is arguing that because police and fire were left out of Act 10, that's a violation of the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. I will always caveat things that I'm one of the non-lawyers at Will, but our perspective is that's a pretty nonsensical argument. There are many instances of state law that don't apply to every, state and local employee. So we think it's a pretty nonsensical argument, but that doesn't mean that it won't be given purchase by the current court.
It's been litigated as well. And the condition of those classifications of employees being emergency services employees is in fact considered differently under state law, and that's been upheld by courts. So let's talk about additional impacts. You just had the governor increase property taxes for schools for 400 years. So if you calculate out of the box impacts of Act 10 plus the ever, geometrically increasing amount of money that has been baked into this bizarre Frankenstein veto that increased school spending forever. What kind of hole could we be looking at here?
Yeah, Wisconsin is already a high property tax state, and this would likely be borne primarily by local taxpayers. This could be a huge increase in property tax bills, probably doubling in a lot of instances. And you talked about the other impacts even beyond this before. We did a few interviews as part of this project. We talked to Josh Showman, the Washington County executive. He mentioned how, on the previous system, you were with the steps and ladders pay system for public sector employees. You're rewarded for the amount of time you stayed in the job. And we can all think of the prototypical government bureaucrat, been there for 30 years, doesn't really care about, servicing the public. What the Act 10 legislation has allowed them to do is actually pay employees based on merit and, reward people that actually do a good job in their career. So even beyond these financial impacts, there could be these intangible sorts of things that we'll see. School districts, we talked to Joe Garza from a school district around the state, and he mentioned to us that they likely have to see program cuts because there's simply no way they could raise taxes high enough to make up for the loss of revenue that this would result in.
Right.
Or the increased cost of revenue.
So you've got a potential and likely doubling of property taxes. Everybody think, what are you paying for your property taxes? You're going to double that. And you're going to not get any better government, and you're not going to get any improvements. You're just going to double that because the most powerful political organization in the state of Wisconsin, the Public Sector Employees Union, and Act 10 did not make them less important or less powerful, has decided that they want your property taxes to double so that they can demand automatic dues remittances and create collective bargaining agreements that cannot be overcome. And, by the way, will have property rights attached to them. So if you think you're going to be able to cut pensions like a private sector union pension might be cut, forget about it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Act 10 was impactful not just in Wisconsin but around the country in terms of a decade of public sector union reform that we saw across the country. Reversing it here could lead to sort of a reversal everywhere, and we could really lose all the ground we've gained in right to work in all these other areas where we've seen important reforms.
Well,
so
we've got Kamala Harris openly saying she's going to eliminate right to work. Even if she doesn't have a Congress that will give her the PRO Act. She wants to get rid of right to work. So that's all gone too. Again, you had the Janus decision. That was a public sector union decision that essentially was Act 10 expanded, right to work protections for employees expanded nationally. But here in Wisconsin, I guess you would still have to technically allow people protections under that particular decision, but you can go back to automatic dues deduction. You can go back to eliminating union elections. You can go back to letting the unions pick their preferred rigged, company health insurance, all of that. Again, it's just money for no reason. It's just money that doesn't have an argument, all because you've got Democrats in the legislature who've been campaigning on this for the last 15 years, and you've got a court case that could potentially go very sideways.
Yeah, you're right. Janus is great. It's good that we have that, but all that really means is that you can't force someone to pay union dues, but the unions can come back in full force and have all of their collective bargaining rights back. All that means is that if someone doesn't want to be in it, it's a good thing to have. That means they won't have to be in it, but it doesn't mean that taxpayers will be better off because of it.
It will, however, mean an enormous amount of pressure not to exercise right to work protections. But again, if right to work goes away, if they actually pass a law, it's going to take years before that goes back before the Supreme Court. And whether the Supreme Court says, yeah, we're going to go with Janus or this law is sufficient to circumvent that particular decision, we have no idea. None whatsoever. So here's the last thing I want to throw out there. Housing costs, which I've talked a lot about on this program. The median price of a home in the state of Wisconsin is over $400,000. You have got reassessments going on locally everywhere, because the market on housing is just insane. So as I ask you to remember doubling or to think about what doubling property taxes means, you could also see a doubling of property taxes based on a reassessment that values your house significantly higher. I mean, I won't even say could, this will kick a certain class of people on fixed income out of the homes that they have owned for decades.
You're absolutely right. The left loves to talk about lowering housing costs. Their only solution is, putting these Kamala Harris things in place that'll just raise the cost of housing even further. While doing this will dramatically increase the cost of housing, even exponentially beyond whatever.
Absolutely
her
true.
Do.
And it does nothing. It does absolutely nothing to rein in housing costs. It explodes housing costs. It's even worse than we're making it sound right now. And I mean, it will price people out of buying homes. It will price people out of staying in homes. By the way, the answer that I've heard about the lack of affordability for people on fixed income as they see their property taxes explode is, well, why don't you just get a reverse mortgage? Why don't you just basically buy your house again so you can pay your taxes? That's what they're saying to people. And that is what if this happens, that's what you're going to hear as well. So, wow, $2.1 billion, and that's just automatic. That's just, it's likely to be a lot worse than that.
Yep, and every year.
Every single year. And we have not calculated the cost of the every single year massive increase in education spending. This is education spending increases that will be on top of those education spending increases so that we can get sub 37% in proficiency in reading and math. Will, thank you very much for joining me on the show. Such good news.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
He always brings the good news, Will does. Will Flanders, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much to Middleton Ford for sponsoring our hotline. Will is with the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and you can see their analysis at will-law.org.